Hello and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at.
I think from the outside, it probably looks bad. It looks like, how are they going to get a deal done?
A report from Washington, D.C. as Congress tries to strike a deal to fund DHS and the debate over the SAVE Act wanes. The Board of Education is set to vote on the next full-time leader of Chicago Public Schools. We have the details. And local reaction to sexual violence allegations against late labor activist Cesar Chavez. First off tonight, funeral services for fallen firefighter Michael Altman had been set for tomorrow, but are being postponed as his widow has gone into labor with the couple's second child. The Chicago Fire Department says today's visitation at St. Rita of Cascia Shrine Chapel on the southwest side will still be held until 8 this evening. The 32-year-old fourth-generation firefighter was killed responding to a building fire in the Rogers Park neighborhood last week. Police have charged a 27-year-old man with murder and arson. He's being held in the Cook County Jail. Some south suburbs are facing the threat of severe weather tonight as residents are still recovering from the last round. The National Weather Service raised the threat level for severe weather today for the area south of Interstate 80. Damaging hail and winds capable of downing tree limbs are possible. A severe thunderstorm watch is in effect through midnight for several areas, including Will and Kankakee counties. It comes just over 2 weeks since tornadoes swept through Livingston and Kankakee counties, along with parts of northwestern Indiana. Earlier today, the group Black Men United distributed supplies to Kankakee residents in need. For tonight, the National Weather Service is expecting a much lower threat for tornadoes. For the third time in the past year, citizens will gather under the banner of No Kings to protest what organizers are calling the authoritarian actions of the Trump administration. Demonstrations are planned around the country for Saturday, including here in Chicago. Local sponsors of the action include the Hands Off Chicago Coalition and the ACLU of Illinois. The largest local protest is planned for Grant Park this Saturday, with additional events planned for the Lakeview and Edgewater neighborhoods and several surrounding suburbs. Unlike the previous two No Kings protests, this weekend's event will take place amid the ongoing war in Iran. For more details, please visit our website. Illinois men's basketball team is still dancing, but they've got a big test ahead of them tonight. The Fighting Illini is taking on number 2 seed Houston in a Sweet 16 matchup. The 3 seed Illinois has handled their first 2 tournament matchups decisively, beating VCU by 21 and Penn by 35 points. The game tips off at 9:05 tonight. And let's hope they fare better than Chicago's baseball teams today. It was opening day, but someone forgot to tell the Cubs and the White Sox. Cubby faithful poured into an unseasonably warm Wrigley Field this afternoon, but the Northsiders got behind after a 6-run 4th inning by the Nationals. The final was 10-4 Nationals. And the Southsiders struggled too as the Sox opened on the road in Milwaukee. A leadoff home run by shortstop Chase Mydroff, but then it was all downhill from there as Brewers starter Jacob Mizorowski struck out 11 and Brewers batters managed 12 hits. Final 14-2 Brewers. But don't worry, only 161 more games to go. Go Chicago. Up next, the latest on news out of Washington, D.C., including DHS shutdown negotiations, right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
There's a lot at stake before Congress members leave town at the end of the week for Easter and Passover break. The partial government shutdown over funding for the Department of Homeland Security wades into its 6th week as TSA employees work without pay, resulting in long lines at major airports. Meanwhile, senators continue to debate the Save America Act, a Trump-backed measure that requires voters to show proof of citizenship at registration. So joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Lisa Desjardins, a correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Lisa, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we'll get to the SAVE Act more deeply in a second, but it is particularly, it's on the back burner right now as lawmakers are trying to pass the new Homeland Security budget. We know that DHS has been shut down since February 13th, leaving TSA agents without pay, many of the country's airports in disarray. How are negotiations going for DHS right now?
Right now, we're at a technical standstill, and I think from the outside, it probably looks bad. It looks like, how are they going to get a deal done? But I will tell you from having covered a lot of these shutdowns that there is a tremendous amount of pressure, especially on the U.S. Senate, be it those TSA lines where they're happening, or people thinking about their travel, or senators themselves who want to leave town. I think that there is a good chance they figure something out in the next couple of days. It really is hard to see them leaving town with this shutdown continuing, but how they figure it out, I guess to quote Shakespeare in Love, it's a mystery, but we're waiting.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to see, many of them fly commercial, right? So I'd be curious to see what the airport experience is like for some of them if that should happen. The SAVE Act, though, it is particularly divisive among lawmakers, with Republicans claiming that it's common sense legislation, while Democrats call it voter suppression. Here's what two lawmakers had to say about it this week.
Polls show that the common sense policies in the Save America Act have support from the American people. But Democrats have repeatedly demonstrated that they don't share the American people's interest in securing our elections.
This legislation, the so-called SAVE Act, has nothing to do with ensuring that elections are conducted with integrity. This is all about trying to prevent a midterm massacre at the polls.
Lisa, remind us how we got here. Why was this bill introduced?
There are a few layers to this, but Leader Jeffries isn't wrong in that President Trump has said that he does think the passage of this act would affect the midterms. He just sees it from the reverse viewpoint. Republicans believe that some of the changes made during the pandemic to voting, many of which had to do with the fact that people were isolated, that we had social distancing, that those benefited unfairly Democrats. So part of this is that same conversation. The other part is an idea that President Trump has put out there falsely, which is that the 2020 election was stolen, including by things like mail-in vote fraud. We know that there is little evidence of any widespread fraud in American voting. And in fact, the last election was declared to be the one with the least amount of fraud across measures of any. However, this is part of how President Trump has pushed his own past in the 2020 election. So what we have now is an act that deals not just with requirements to register for vote, but requirements to vote at the polls, and also whether mail-in voting should be allowed. Now, those issues all cut different ways across American society. The idea of being required to present an ID at the polls is generally very popular, but the details matter, and then those other two provisions on citizenship and on mail-in vote, people feel differently about those.
Lisa, we have a local political reporter here who says about City Hall, when you have the votes, you vote. They've been debating this. Does the Senate GOP, do they have the votes for this?
They do not have the votes for this. It takes 60 votes usually to get past cloture on the SAVE Act. They're nowhere near that. They have 53 Republicans, but we know that there are Republicans, at least two, who oppose this. One of them is the Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski. She says, this would just make a mess of elections in our state. We have a rural state. People would not be able to get the documents they need easily. Mail-in vote is critical in our state. We think this would prohibit it too much. And some of these senators also say this particular version of this bill would go into effect immediately. They just don't think their states are ready for it, or that it has been thought out enough. Others disagree, of course, but this is all to say Republicans, in fact, do not have the votes.
All right, a couple seconds left, Lisa. If passed, if implemented, what documents would be suitable for voters to present?
It depends. For citizenship, you would need an original birth certificate, passport, some forms of military ID, or you could sign an affidavit. For voter ID, that also is in question, but most real IDs would pass. And this is part of the issue too. Each state has different requirements now, and there are a lot of question marks about exactly how that would work.
Okay, whole lot of question marks. Lisa Desjardins in D.C., they're breaking it down for us. Appreciate it.
You got it.
Up next, Chicago Public Schools could finally have a permanent leader. Chicago Public Schools may finally have a full-time leader. The Board of Education is set to vote on appointing interim CEO Macquline to the full-time position. The former CPS principal has served in the interim role since last summer. The vote will come after a months-long search process, which saw other candidates from across the country vie for the position and then drop out of consideration. If approved, King's $380,000 a year contract will take effect July 1st. Joining us to break down the vote is our own Matt Masterson. Matt, welcome back. So I think, the question that a lot of people are wondering is why go through this months-long candidate search process only to ultimately appoint someone who had been doing the job already since last summer?
Yeah, well, Brandis, the board needed to be thorough. I don't think anyone wanted to see somebody appointed just to the full-time position. They wanted to go through this national search. They went through a nationwide search of, they said, over 100 candidates who submitted their applications. They ultimately ended up back on King, but they went through this process and it did not go exactly as they had hoped. There were dropouts of finalists whose names were leaked. The firm that was brought on by the board to lead the search was let go last month. Ultimately, though, the board did find someone that they feel that they're ready to name as full-time CEO in King.
Okay, so as we mentioned, she's been the interim since last summer. What's been her record on the job?
Well, she came in at a very difficult time, which is typically the case with Chicago Public Schools, but she navigated a very difficult budget process. She came in as the district faced a $730 million budget shortfall. She was able to pass a balanced budget last year, and she did so in a way that ran contrary to what Mayor Brandon Johnson had been pushing for, which was significant borrowing by the district. She passed this budget without doing so. She also came in during a time when Operation Midway Blitz was going on in the city. Immigration enforcement caused undue stress to families, students, staff, teachers across the city. She led the district through this time as well. She launched a command center for CPS to respond to concerns and criticisms during this time as well. So she received a lot of praise from the board, from other education officials for how she handled these situations that she was thrown into last year.
So just 2 weeks ago, we reported that the race was down to 3 finalist candidates. How did she emerge as the apparent full-time CEO?
Well, her background certainly as a teacher and principal in Chicago Public Schools helps. She's worked in City Hall with Mayor Brandon Johnson. That is obviously working in her favor as well. But she also had something that no other candidate had, which was a 9-month head start on this position. She has been in this role. The board has been able to see that. They don't have to guess what she'll look like as CPS CEO. They've been able to watch it for months and months, and we'll see how Monday's vote goes, but it appears that they're fully on board with her vision for the future of Chicago Public Schools.
Some members of the Chicago Board of Education, they accuse, though, Mayor Brandon Johnson of sabotaging or attempting to sabotage the selection process. Of course, Macquline, as you mentioned, former education policy advisor to Mayor Johnson. Tell us about some of those accusations.
Well, as you know, the board is currently split between elected and appointed official board members. This was a group of elected officials who said that Mayor Brandon Johnson and his appointed board members were trying to politically interfere with this process, that they slowed things down. These elected members instead wanted to hold off until 2027, when the board will be fully elected, to pick a new CPS CEO. But those elected members did, in that letter where they accused the mayor of this sabotage, they offered a full-throated support of Macquline staying on through the next school year. So they're very behind her vision, as I said. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see you on Monday. Matt Masterson, thank you.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Matt's full story on our website. It is all at WTTW.com/news. Chicagoans are reacting to sexual abuse accusations made against the late labor leader Cesar Chavez. A New York Times investigation last week found Chavez groomed and sexually abused young girls who worked in his movement, along with union co-founder Dolores Huerta. 95-year-old Huerta says she kept her silence for 60 years out of fear of harming the movement. In response to the allegations, cities across the country, including Chicago, have been grappling with removing his name from parks and other landmarks. Joining us now are Angela Anderson, President and CEO of Mujeres Latinas en Acción, Samantha Royal, Institutional Advancement Director with the Latino Union of Chicago, and by Zoom, State Representative Norma Hernandez, a Democrat whose district includes Melrose Park, Bensonville, and Franklin Park, among others. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. So obviously this investigation, it breaks last week with these disturbing details. Hard to process at first, right? Because this is new, very new news. I want to get your initial reactions upon hearing this. Angela, I'd like to start with you, please.
I think first and foremost, we're devastated. And, we're really thinking about the survivors. We're thinking about Deborah, we're thinking about Dolores, we're thinking about everybody else who's had to be silent. Maybe it just happened recently, maybe they've been holding it for a long time. And I hope, the way the community has reacted, that they feel accompanied.
Samantha?
Yes, I think this only shows us that even though we are in modern times, there's still a lot of fear about and around these situations, especially within women, within children that are victims of this. And now better than ever, we can advocate for those that have raised their voices.
Representative, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, echoing what everyone here is saying, and really shocked, but more shocked about how long women have been having to hold this inside and protecting the movement, even though it's hurting them inside, to keep the silence. So just really shocked and disappointed, because women are always having to, suffer in silence. And I'm just grateful that they are now being able to open and use their voice for this moment.
Representative, say more about that, about feeling the need to protect the movement, and by that, to some degree, feeling the need to protect the man.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about, even now when we do this work, it's not just one person, right? It's about a bigger picture. And for Dolores, for example, and the other women that spoke up, it was a selfless thing to do, to not think about themselves first and to think about others, and to protect the bigger picture, even though it's killing them inside, to keep silence. And it's something that's a pattern, especially culturally, with women of color. Somehow women end up having to suffer more in silence than having to protect themselves. They protect others.
Angela, your organization, Mujeres Latinas en Acción, you work with survivors of gender-based violence. Dolores Huerta says that she remained silent for 60 years, as we've said, out of fear of hurting the movement. What are some of the obstacles that survivors that they face when they think about or avoid sharing their encounters?
There's so many obstacles, from shame, from fear of retaliation. If you're a woman with limited resources, your family, your children can be put at risk. Just even being able to provide and have what you need, a roof over your head. There's so many factors. And I think culturally, we have grown up with so many others silent around us. And so when we don't talk about it and we don't have a model of how to speak up for ourselves, it makes it even that more difficult.
Right, and some of these instances happened at a time when like you say, victims, survivors were treated the way you described.
Right.
Harder to come forward even then.
Yes.
Samantha, the World Health Organization estimates 1 in 3 women and girls ages 15 and older worldwide have been subjected to physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence, non-partner sexual violence, or both at least once in their lifetime. 263 million girls and women aged 15 and older experiencing sexual violence from someone other than a partner at least once in their lifetime. What do you think perpetuates this kind of violence? What do we know?
I think, as here was mentioned, there's a lot of cultural factors, there's a lot of social factors that perpetuate these actions. And it's also the disrespect that has been historically against women. Men, society, we live in a system that it's oppressive of women, women's rights, women's health. And so all of that, it's part of the problem that puts women in these positions of being vulnerable towards others.
Representative Hernandez, how do you think this news will impact the legacy of the Farmers United movement?
Well, I do think it impacts the legacy of Cesar Chavez, but I also believe that one person doesn't mean the entire movement. And there's many new leaders and leaders that are still doing their own amazing work and creating their own legacies. So I think it's important to highlight that more, that this is a one person, this impacts Cesar Chavez's legacy, but it doesn't impact the farm workers movement, because the movement comes from many. And it's important to always remember that.
Angela, same question to you. How do you think the movement and its legacy, the memory, will be impacted?
I mean, I think for me, I'm thinking more about how it affects how we organize, how we hold each other accountable, how do we even hold power? You know, whether we're the leader, whether we're leading a group of women, whether we're, you know, trying to organize people and get them to volunteer. Sort of what are the messages and how can we recalibrate how we communicate and reflect on the impact that we have on one another so that we can build safety. And if there's an event and that they know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate so that they can stand up for themselves and let other people know so that this doesn't have to happen again.
Samantha, same question. Like, how, as someone with Latino Union, how do you think the legacy will be impacted?
It's definitely that the power is not only led by one person. The movement is not only led by one person. It's collective power, the union of different leaders. And so, first and foremost, the recognition of that, and just to replicate what it was said. Just to be educated and to protect who has to be protected and to expose who has to be exposed. It's not about exposing or leaving the movement to the side. It's about individuals damaging the movement.
Representative Hernandez, how do you think communities should handle the naming or renaming of schools and other memorials in his honor, now that this has come to light?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely signifies accountability. We saw this happen during the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement where statues were being taken down. So it's a sign of accountability. Obviously, there's many other instances with other leaders that we know have caused some damage to others and their statues are still there. But I think for this moment, it does signify accountability. And I agree, you know, what needs to get done, it needs to get done.
Angela, what might justice look like for the survivors?
I don't believe there is justice for the survivors. They have to live with the wound for the rest of their lives. I think if we have to look at it through the lens of justice, I think how do we work with our legal system so they have more rights and resources available to them so when they need them. Also, how do we put into question the behavior and patterns of men that have been sort of, you know, in a conditioned by patriarchy and also different privileges. It's more, I think, I want to focus on the healing, right? How do we get past healing while being wounded at the same time? And I think when we can get past that, we can kind of look at a broader horizon.
Samantha, you know, how do you sort of reconcile like the man that so many people revered, right, with what we now know about him? How do you hold those two things in one person?
I think it's important to believe the victim, and in this case, the victims, 100%, because they have nothing to lose. The one thing that they had to lose, apparently in the past, they didn't lost it. And this is just like, I think, since it's been such a long time and such different times, it is one thing to hold on.
Representative Hernandez, same question to you. How do you hold these two things that you know about one man? Does what you know about him now take away from what he did, from the positive legacy that he also leaves?
Well, I think, you know, when it comes to him and his actions and separating what happened with the movement, again, it was a collective of people that he happened to be a part of as well and had helped lead. And I think it's important to recognize that, but at the same time, how much abuse occurred during the moments that he was doing that, I think that also has to be educated and told. So we have to call that for what it is, and that education piece then will have to come with that as well. We can no longer hide that he was this person that didn't do any of that. So I do believe it requires to understand, yes, he was able to accomplish this work, but at the same time, there was a lot of harm that was done by his actions as well.
Angela?
He's definitely not the same leader anymore. He's an abuser, he's a predator, and he is a model now that we're gonna have to keep in mind when we watch out for other predators and abusers in our community.
Is that hard to come to?
It's not,
reality?
because unfortunately the data tells us that there's so many abusers out there. And there are many other cases, as we've seen with the Epstein files, and we see how families are being abused in ICE detention and so forth. He's not a standalone person by his violations towards people in our community.
That is where we'll have to leave it. Thanks to the three of you for joining us, Angela Anderson, Samantha Royal, and Representative Norma Hernandez. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Reflecting the people and perspectives that make up our communities, this story is part of Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices.
And that's our show for this Thursday night. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 7 for the Week in Review. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm with more than 40 years of experience in medical malpractice.